Welcome to today's keynote on the changing requirements for IVD manufacturers that are introduced with the EU Regulation 2017/746, also known as IVDR. This keynote is brought to you by NSF PROSYSTEM, a company of NSF International. My name is Dr. Peter Wirtschaft. I'm your host today, and I will guide you through the new and most demanding aspects of the IVDR. Leveraging more than 12 years of experience from research, development, production, and marketing of IVD devices, I'm leading the NSF International service offerings for the IVD industry in Europe. I am your point of contact if you want to harness our services for your IVD business. A few words about our organization. NSF International is an independent, non-for-profit, and non-governmental health organization. The very core of our mission is to provide help in protecting human health and safety at a worldwide scale. In Europe, NSF International provides its services to medical device manufacturers via its wholly owned company, NSF PROSYSTEM. Headquartered in Hamburg, NSF PROSYSTEM provides consulting, training, like this one, documentation and development support in the medical engineering field. NSF International is actively involved in several national and international standardization groups covering the most important aspects of medical engineering, such as quality and risk management, software development, and usability engineering. With the inside knowledge from creating these standards, we can strengthen your company's position in the medical device market, as we have done for many businesses so far. A brief disclaimer. The information I'm providing you is based on what has been available as of today, and of course is subject to change due to the currently evolving regulatory landscape. Part of the information also represents my personal understanding of the regulatory requirements in the European Union. So use this opportunity here to share and discuss your own interpretation and point of view with me via the chat function or via email. And together, we may bring back new insights into your company. I will focus in this keynote on three main topics. First of all, we will look at the new classification scheme of the IVDR so that you can get a better idea where your product may fall into and must conform with. Second, we will hear about all the new requirements on the technical file and the QM system that you need to establish for your product. And lastly, we will get from there a closer look of what is required for the so-called performance evaluation. With the IVDR coming into full force, the regulatory landscape for IVD products would change in the European Economic Area. IVDs are still regulated via the Directive 98/79, the so-called IVDD. If the European Commission issues a directive, it actually directs the member states to transpose the rules into national law, meaning the directive is not law until it is transposed into member state law. And of course, different member states have different legislative procedures that may lead to a time delay and thus a patchwork of member states with and without implemented regulations. The difference to a directive is that a EU regulation is immediately law in all EU member states, so no transposition is necessary. This ensures also regulatory uniformity, since we do not have to wait for some member state to pass the regulation through the legislative system. Some issues are nevertheless deferred to be regulated by the member states. For example, Spain added language requirements for the product's accompanying information, and Germany added certification requirements for individuals active in sales of medical devices. The IVDR will come into full force at the 26th of May 2022. Yet the EU Commission recently proposed an extension of the transition period to gradually phase in the requirements for different risk classes. This was necessary mainly due to the current shortage of notified bodies, from which manufacturer will require conformity assessments for most of their devices. Note, however, that unsterile Class A devices, as well as devices for which no conformity has been declared under IVDD, which essentially are most products currently in development, must be compliant to the IVDR from the get-go. Note also devices that will be classified as unsterile class A under IVDR, which you have placed on the market before the 26th of May 2022, can be still made available for another 3 years. A short side note on placing products on the market. A product is placed on the market when it is made available for the very first time on the EU market. Making available on the market means when the product is supplied for distribution, consumption, or use on the union market in the course of a commercial activity, whether in return for payment or free of charge. Now, devices that would be classified as Class D, C, B, or sterile Class A under the IVDR can be still placed on the market with a CE IVDD mark until the indicated time points. For example, an IVD product classified into risk class C under IVDR can be still placed on the market as CE IVDD until the 26th of May 2026. After this date, it must be compliant to the IVDR. Devices that you have placed on the market before the 26th of May 2026 can be still made available for another year as indicated by the yellow bars. This, of course, provided you have implemented a PMS and vigilance system according to the IVDR, and you refrain from introducing any significant changes to the design, manufacturer, or intended purpose. And plus, you also registered with the UDAMED database modules. Even though there is no guidance for significant changes of IVDs available at the moment, I suggest you look into MDCG 2023 on significant changes for medical devices that gives you a good idea how to deal practically when faced with introducing changes to your device during the transition period. Approaching the new regulatory requirements usually leads to questions such as, how big are actually our gaps in the technical documentation? Or do we need to replace or adapt or even establish new processes? And of course, IVDR implementation is not the only high priority project for keeping your products on the market. There are other business-related projects of equal importance. And the question then usually is, can you get it all done with the resources and capacity at hand? Often the available time and possible timelines those mutate to a gut feeling rather than a true estimate. So let's approach the biggest hurdles. When approaching the IVDR with your product, I recommend you first classify it to the new classification rules. This will actually set the scene which IVDR requirements apply to your product. If you look at the left pie chart, you will see that under IVDD, manufacturers could self-declare conformity for over 90% of all products. Only high-risk IVD products, such as those used in blood group determination or products used as self-tests by laypersons, require a conformity assessment by a notified body. This will actually turn 180 degrees with the IVDR, as you may notice on the right pie chart. Now, only for about a quarter of all IVD products, manufacturer can self-declare conformity. These are usually low-risk products of Class A, such as instruments or consumables. For the vast majority of products, however, manufacturer will now require a conformity assessment by a notified body before they can declare conformity to the IVDR. Let's get an idea of how the IVDR classification system works. You see from this chart that you go along 7 rules through which you determine the risk class based on your product's intended use. For example, Rule 1 asks if your IVD product is intended for detecting a transmissible agent that causes a life-threatening disease, such as HIV or SARS coronavirus 2. If that's the case, your product is going to be in the highest risk class, the so-called Class D. On the other hand, if your IVD product is, let's say, a centrifuge, Rule 5 would apply and your product is being categorized as a Class A device. Now, instead of flipping the pages in Annex VIII, I have added a link to this printable IVD classification chart that you can use to discuss with your colleagues which possible class your products will fall into. Now let's get step by step through the risk classes and which requirements of the IVDR apply to the products therein. Class A is the lowest risk class and includes products such as instruments and consumables. Even though you can self-declare conformity for these products, You must draw up the technical documentation according to Annex II and as well the documentation of your post-market surveillance according to Annex III. As we will hear later, all manufacturers must establish a full quality management system according to the requirements laid out in Article 10. Only then manufacturers can declare conformity to the IVDR according to Article 17. Now, even though you may not need to involve a notified body, many competent authorities are filling the void to carry out oversight for Class A devices. Also, there is an exception to the rule. If your Class A device is a sterile product, your processes for sterilization must be audited by a notified body. Lastly, if you're a manufacturer of instruments to which the Machinery Directive applies, please look at Article 3 that stipulates if requirements in a relevant regulation are formulated more precisely than in the Machinery Directive, those requirements find application. Typical Class B products are self-tests of lower risk, such as pregnancy tests, whereas a typical Class C product would be a PCR assay that detects tumor-associated gene mutations. Similar to Class A, also for products of Class B and C, you need to draw up the technical documentation and the documentation of your PMS activities. Again, you need to establish a full QMS, and starting now from Class B, you need to invite a notified body for a conformity assessment. Only with a valid assessment certificate from your notified body, you are allowed to declare conformity in accordance to Article 17. In case your product is intended for self or near patient testing, make sure you first lodge an application with your notified body for the assessment of your technical documentation. In Annex IV, Chapter 2, under Section 5.1, you find what you are expected to include in this application. If you manufacture IVD products intended for companion diagnostics, your products will automatically classify as Class C device. Similar to self and near patient testing devices, make sure you also lodge an application with your notified body for the assessment of your technical file. In terms of planning and timelines, you need to consider that your notified body will consult the medical competent authority during conformity assessment, such as the EMA, and this easily may add an additional 120 days to your schedule. As you might remember, Class D is the highest risk class that demands the most of manufacturers. Typical products are those intended for blood group determination or tissue typing for transplantation purposes. Class D devices must also undergo batch verification. During batch verification, the notified body may ask an EU reference laboratory to verify the claimed performance and compliance of your IVD product with the common specifications through laboratory testing. Again, if your device is for self or near patient testing, lodge an application for the assessment of your technical file as described before. Manufacturers of Class C and D devices can also choose an alternative conformity assessment procedure, the so-called EU type examination. Here, the manufacturer submits an application to the notified body, including the technical documentation, a description of processes applicable during the product life cycle, and a prototype of the product. Based on this representative sample, the notified body will assess the conformity to the IVDR, and if the prototype conforms to the regulation, the notified body issues a so-called EU type examination certificate. Obviously, there is much to consider when declaring conformity or when applying for a conformity assessment at your notified body. To get a better handle, and instead of flipping pages all the time, I added a link to the NSF conformity assessment chart. You can use this printable chart to refer to the relevant parts of the IVDR that contain requirements based on each risk class that you need to observe for the conformity assessment of your product. Typical questions that arise at this stage are, for example, what happens to the risk classification if you would include or exclude use cases from the intended purpose of your product? Also, you may think about if it still makes economical sense in terms of return on investment if you would try to conform with all the specific requirements for a given risk class. And if so, there's also a strategic aspect to it when classifying your product. For example, manufacturers of products such as NGS systems that include an assay, an instrument, and an analytical software may consider to classify each component individually so that, for example, the instrument will be a Class A and significant changes here would not require you to invite a notified body. At the very same time, the notified body could focus on the more high-risk components such as targeted assay or analytical software. And of course, this would also reduce your audit costs. Now let's assume you identified the risk class your product falls into, and you got also a first idea on what will be included in the conformity assessment so that in the end you can declare conformity to the IVDR successfully. As you may have seen, all risk classes have in common that the IVDR demands a technical documentation and a full quality management system. Now let's have a look of what is demanded from manufacturers when compiling the technical file and establishing a QM system for the IVD product. Article 10 of the IVDR requires every IVD manufacturer to establish a full quality management system and also defines the requirements that such a system needs to comply with. In paragraph 2 and point C, the IVDR wants manufacturers to define the organization with all its processes and derived responsibilities, in particular referring to top management. This is also linked to Article 15, that requires manufacturers to have a person responsible for regulatory compliance at each manufacturing site. I have added the link to a recent MDCG guidance on this topic that helps you to define and implement this position in your organization. Apart from defining processes and responsibilities, your QM policy should also describe how you're going to ensure continued conformity of your products to the IVDR. Your QMS should also address how you identify applicable general safety and performance requirements, so-called GSPRs, for each device. Your QMS must also describe the processes you're employing for product realization, starting from planning to design, development, and production. To increase traceability, medical devices in the EU must carry a unique device identifier. That's why your QMS must have processes in place with which you verify that UDIs are assigned to each of your devices. When it comes to suppliers, the buck stops at you. Manufacturers are required to actively manage the selection and control of critical suppliers and subcontractors. This also includes regular auditing activities. For the IVDR, risk management and continuous product improvement are vital components of a manufacturer's QMS. Risk management also includes a system that describes your post-market surveillance activities and ensures the management of corrective and preventive actions and the verification of their effectiveness. With your QMS, you should also establish vigilance processes to ensure serious incidents and also required field safety corrective actions are communicated to competent authorities and your customers. Your organization may have already established a quality management system for medical devices, such as the one described by industry standard ISO 13485. If so, you have only to meet the additional requirements of the IVDR, because the regulation adopted most of the procedures of ISO 13485. And if you don't have a QMS yet, better use this industry standard. To better understand the delta between IVDR and ISO 13485, I have added a link to the SEN guidance that shows you the relationship between the standard and the device regulation. As we have heard, the manufacturer is required to fully document all steps during product realization. Yet the IVDR does not tell us how to exactly implement these requirements. Let's have a look how to tackle this challenge using the product realization as an example. You can find the solution to this challenge actually within Article 8, in which the IVDR encourages us to make use of harmonized standards which are referenced in the official journal of the European Union and are presumed to be in conformity with the regulation. Now, in case no harmonized standard exists, I would suggest you use instead an ISO standard that is applicable to your case. If you look at the left side of the schematic, we usually start to plan and design the product with the user in mind. In Annex 1.5, the IVDR is explicitly asking to address ergonomics for reducing use errors within the use environment. We can do so by applying the International Standard for Usability Engineering, EC 62366. Also, we can apply specific product standards, which may not be always harmonized, but would also help us to ensure functionality, safety, and performance. Such standards could be, for example, ISO 9241 for visual data representation, or ISO 20961 for conducting performance studies. Now let's go over to the right side of the schematic. The use of every product will come with potential hazards. Also in Annex I, the IVDR requires us to consider hazards and hazardous situations that may potentially induce harm. Now the best way to do proper risk management is by applying the industry standard ISO 14971 together with TR 20416 to implement PMS. This should allow us to continuously assess a risk-benefit so that we can ensure the product provides a medical benefit to the patient. I added for you also a link to the ISO TR 24971. In this document, in Annex VIII, you will find a guidance in how to apply risk management specifically to IVD products. Well, and since all of these activities need to be documented and controlled, we apply a full quality management system as the IVDR demands. And the industry standard for this, as we have seen, is ISO 13485. Now let's move to another requirement common to all risk classes, the technical documentation. In Annex II, the IVDR demands that the technical documentation shall be presented in a clear, organized, readily searchable, and unambiguous manner. Now, to achieve this, two common formats have been used frequently. On the one hand, the so-called STED format by the former GHTF, and the so-called IVD-MATOC by the successor organization IMDRF. Well, whatever format you choose, if you require a notified body for conformity assessment, you better ask beforehand which format they prefer, and maybe they even have their own one. Then use their format, as it is always a good idea to make the auditor's life as easy as possible. And also, it makes your life a lot easier if you use a document management system to ensure proper versioning and access to your documents. Let's have a closer look at the STED format to get an idea about the content and structure of those elements that are required by the IVDR within the technical documentation. This starts with the description and specification of the device. The file should also include information to the product that are commonly supplied by the manufacturer to the user. Of course, as we have heard before, the technical file should also include a complete documentation of product design and manufacturing. You may also remember that a manufacturer is required to consider all general safety and performance requirements relevant to the product. A checklist of those GSPRs should document that you did so. You should also take care to add all documents concerning product verification and validation. This includes the performance evaluation, which we will deal with later on. And lastly, the risk management file, including the documentation about your PMS activities, should also be part of your technical documentation. I added a link to our TechFile Factory service offerings. This department can help you to build a complete technical file for your product. Now let's get a step further and look at typical content examples for each area of the technical documentation. For the product description, examples would be a description of the intended purpose, a product or system specification, a description of variants, and maybe a version history. The information supplied by the manufacturer usually include labeling of the packaging and the device, the unique device identifier, and the instruction for use. When considering applicable general safety and performance requirements, we may see a description of risks that can occur during use, hazards associated with the product, storage conditions required for the product to maintain integrity or to ensure data safety, but also instruction for correct disposal in order to avoid environmental harm. Typically, in the risk management file, we would expect a risk management plan, a risk analysis, and a risk management report about performed activities. Particularly for instruments and analytical software, take also into account IVDR requirements on cybersecurity, for which MDCG 2019-16 gives you implementation guidance. Here, especially the integration into your PMS activities will be key to swiftly react on identified threats. For a documentation of the product realization, we would include, for example, a list of all ingredients, a description of the system or manufacturing process, and also information on critical suppliers. Typical content that documents product verification and validation would be, for example, tests with applicable sample types and collection methods, verification of product stability, but also reports on analytical and clinical performance, which brings us to the performance evaluation. Related to the technical documentation, the IVDR will also have a major impact on your business relationships, in particular when it comes to so-called OEM PLM constellations, since Article 16 abolishes them altogether. In a typical OEM PLM constellation, the so-called original equipment manufacturer offers product to so-called private label manufacturers who relabel the product of the OEM under their own brand name, while the OEM holds the complete technical documentation to which the PLMs only refer to. Now, this would change in that the PLM will be required to hold the complete technical file. In case this is not possible, because, for example, the OEM considers aspects of the technical file very sensitive, the PLM can now only operate as distributor and must add the full name and address of the OEM on the product label. In case the OEM is open to transferring the complete technical file, the PLM steps into the role as a manufacturer, with the OEM becoming now a subcontractor. OEM PLM constellations exist for a very good reason. The OEMs can focus on their core expertise, namely manufacturing products, while the PLMs can focus on theirs, which is marketing the products to the right customers. From working together with several manufacturing partnerships to mediate solutions and to solve issues, I suggest you clarifying the roles in your business relationships early on. Maybe you take over the role as a legal manufacturer, which would require you that you gain access to the relevant parts of the technical documentation, an often contentious point during negotiations. Or you focus exclusively on distribution, for which you should observe Article 14 of the IVDR that describes the legal requirements for distributors. In case you act as a supplier, you may also be subject to audits by the manufacturer and its notified bodies. Further, I suggest you sorting out who will provide relevant parts of the technical file, and please focus here on controlled documents rather than uncontrolled technical descriptions such as source codes or PCB data. A quality assurance agreement can help here to put decisions into a binding contract. This is even more important to not strain the relationship, particularly when it comes to intellectual property, which may be business relevant to your partner, even though it may be appearing to you as trivial information. When we look back on the requirements for QMS and the technical documentation, you should ask if your organization has all the required processes, documents, and data together. Often various information needed to fulfill the requirements of the IVDR are scattered throughout the organization. Also start identifying all relevant standards for your product so you can ensure to conform with the IVDR requirements, in particular when it comes to product realization. And think about how to structure your technical file in a way that allows maintenance during the complete product life cycle, but also enables an auditor to easily search and find information as proof for conformity. In this third part, we will take a closer look at the key elements of the performance evaluation. The performance evaluation for IVDs was already introduced with the IVDD, but has now been much more formalized and specified in the IVDR. The main purpose of the performance evaluation is to provide clinical evidence that the product is capable to achieve its intended purpose. You build clinical evidence with three key elements: a report on scientific validity of your test or instrument, a report in which you demonstrate the IVD's analytical performance, and a report on how the IVD performs with real clinical samples. Now let's have a look what these key elements may contain. Since you established your clinical evidence based on the intended purpose of your IVD product, it is worth looking at what the IVDR expects with regard to content. First of all, you should identify the analyte your IVD product measures or detects, and also the associated pathophysiology. Next, briefly describe the diagnostic technology your IVD employs, followed by the intended user and the intended patient population. Also be aware that device-specific information may need to be included. If, for example, you have a CTX device, you also need to include the medicinal product associated with your device. The first key element to establish clinical evidence is your report on scientific validity. Within this report, you establish the link between the analyte that your device measures or detects and the pathophysiology to which the presence or absence of your analyte points to. For example, detecting RNA transcripts of the N gene from SARS coronavirus 2 in patient samples has been established as being connected to COVID-19. Such a link you need to demonstrate for scientific validity, and you can source information for this purpose from devices using the same analyte, peer review publications, experts' reports, or clinical studies. The second building block is to demonstrate the analytical performance of your IVD product. Here you usually employ spiked samples with known amounts of your analyte, to which you could also add defined amounts of background material that may occur in clinical samples. This would also consider that your IVD product usually interacts with all sample components, hopefully, however, preferably with the target analyte. With these samples, you may establish the sensitivity of your product for the target analyte, often also referred to as limit of detection. Also, you demonstrate its specificity for the target analyte over other interferences. And as well, you demonstrate the accuracy of your IVD product, meaning how correctly and precisely the analyte is being detected or measured. The last building block for clinical evidence is to demonstrate your product's clinical performance, meaning its capability to deliver diagnostic results in clinical routine settings. To this end, you want to show your product's diagnostic sensitivity and specificity using clinical samples. Here you demonstrate by using a comparative method, often also called the gold standard, how well your product identifies truly positive or truly negative patients. With the predictive value, you show how many people were actually ill in whom the test procedure determined the physiological conditions via the analyte. And with the likelihood ratio, you provide evidence how likely it is that the test result will occur in a patient with or without target disease. You can source often information for demonstrating clinical performance to a large extent from previous clinical trials or from peer-reviewed publication. Nevertheless, it may be necessary that you also conduct your own performance studies, for which I've added here the link to ISO 20916, which you can apply to ensure you fulfill the IVDR requirements for performance studies. We only touched briefly the main building blocks of the performance evaluation, but there is much more to it. You may consider that you need a process for initiating and conducting performance evaluations, including templates for the plan and report. And of course, the IVDR does not tell you how to structure this. And if you use peer review publications as a source for clinical evidence, you are expected to perform a systematic literature research that is completely traceable from the initial search result to the final relevant publication. And lastly, there's always the question whether you may need to conduct your very own performance studies, which may take time and resources. If you haven't, then take action now. There's a lot to do if you want to continue offering your products to your customers under IVDR. Start with classifying your product or its system components, also with an eye towards the future so that you can stay compliant to the IVDR continuously. Update your quality management system by applying the latest version of ISO 13485 and start as soon as possible to establish new processes, since this can take time within an organization, as you may know from change management. Also, identify the gaps in your technical documentation to better understand the delta to the IVDR requirements and make a plan to systematically close these gaps. Your team's resources are not only needed for implementing the IVDR, but are key to other business-relevant projects as well. With our services, we support you in all aspects of clinical and regulatory affairs, where we help creating and updating performance evaluations, implementing risk management, and everything you need for post-market surveillance. Our Tech File Factory can provide you with gap assessments of your technical documentation and even build IVDR-compliant technical files for your product. With our QMS Builder, we can implement complete quality management systems or integrate separate processes as needed. We also can provide you gap assessments and remediations to ensure your QM system is IVDR compliant. And with our audit services, you can practice and mock audits so that you're ready when the notified body steps through your doors. Getting support from outside partners is as important as to embed critical knowledge and expertise in your organization. Bring you up to speed by using our rich offerings on deep dive seminars on all regulatory aspects relevant to the new regulation. Also, use our knowledge library, where you can find the infographics I provided links for you and many more resources such as white papers or webinars. If you're interested in our trainings or services, feel free to also contact my colleagues who will ensure that you get a solution tailored to your needs. From my experience in operation at manufacturers, I'm well aware of what lies ahead of you. This would truly require a team effort. So I wish you, your colleagues, your company good luck for your implementation of the IVDR.